All right, everyone, we're going to get started with the presentation. I just wanted to take a second to say thank you all for joining us this evening. This is a very good turnout for us. We are on our second workshop for the MBTA 3A zoning review, as well as just talking about housing in general. I see a few familiar faces that attended the first workshop, so this workshop will be a little bit different. We'll be taking it to the next step and taking a look closer at some of the options that we have available to us. For those of you who do not know me, I am Rebecca Oldham. I am the town administrator. I also serve as a town planner. I have been working with our consultant, Emily Inez, and her team, Supriya, and we have been taking a closer look at the regulations and the legislation that is put before us as to compliance with the MBTA 3A zoning. We've mentioned it a lot during some of our select board meetings, planning meetings, and we've talked a lot about how we can comply and what that means. We've also talked a lot about funding and making sure that we meet the deadline for the December 30th, 2025 compliance date. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who is going to talk more about the process and some of their findings, and we hope that you will find this information helpful. If there's any questions or anything afterwards that you would like more information on or that we can follow up on, please feel free to reach out to myself or Annie Schindler, the executive coordinator, email, phone, or just drop by the office, and we'd be happy to provide you any additional information. So without further ado, Emily.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces. How many of you were at the last workshop, just so I can know? All right, most of you. Some of you will have a little bit of a repeat on these first few slides, but Supriya, there we go. Okay. So Supriya is going to walk you through the interactive session at the end, but I'll start off with a review. We're also here with Jimmy. If you did not sign in and pick up your cards, you will need them, so you can do that after we finish the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the timeline, because we are aiming for the Springtown meeting, how we got to this point, because we're not just talking about Section 3A, we're talking about housing in general. A little bit about our existing conditions analysis, which is up there, and then what Section 3A means for Groveland, and then we'll start working with the materials that we have today. So just, again, the team that Rebecca mentioned and some of the faces from our team that you'll be seeing through the process. So here's our timeline. We started off doing the analysis of your existing zoning and the existing conditions. A lot of that was mapping to understand what you have on the ground relative to what your zoning is. We do a lot when we're coming into a community and we're talking about housing and economic development, we're talking about zoning changes. Frequently in New England communities, there's a difference between what's actually built and what the zoning is. That's because in many cases, zoning came in after these buildings were built, right? We're a lot older in New England than zoning, which came in say, the 1920s, 30s, up to the 60s. I've got one community right now where their zoning was first passed in 1967. And they've been settled since the 1700s. So it doesn't always work. So that's why we do a lot of existing conditions analysis. And we're kind of in the period of finishing that up, starting to think about how the draft zoning, and we're doing design guidelines as well, would work. But as part of thinking that, we need to talk to people and find out what their preferences are. So that's the period we're in now. We had the workshop kind of at the end of our analysis of zoning and existing conditions in November. As we think about how the zoning would work, this is our last workshop for this. Then we're going to start, after we talk with you today, putting this into text format so we can see, okay, now that we've heard what makes sense, how does it get written? How would it get integrated in, and then start moving that forward into the process for town meeting. So we're looking at the draft zoning and guidelines coming out after this, revising it, testing it our end to make sure it works, and then bringing it forward for the town meeting process. So a couple of things that we did. First of all, the 2023 comprehensive plan talked about making some changes to the zoning to address housing. And then you also did a housing production plan a little bit earlier that talks about how do you get more housing. And the key thing that we found in these findings is older adults are unable to age within their community because if they want to downsize, the housing types that would allow them to downsize aren't really present in Groveland. It's mostly single family housing, upstairs, downstairs. So as you age, as it becomes more difficult, where can you move? And quite frequently I'll get a comment in a community that says, well, next door, the community next door has this sort of housing, but that means people are leaving their community. And so we want to find a way, how do people age in place within the community? Young adults, people growing up now, housing prices have gotten to the point where they may have gone to high school in a community in an earlier era where prices were low, maybe they left, they went to college, they got their first job in another community, but they want to come back to where they grew up. Housing prices are such it's not really possible anymore. So again, how do we think about maybe smaller housing units, smaller dwelling units where a young person, young couple could come in and kind of rebuild. And then residential property communities are primarily dependent on residential property taxes, suburbs in general. And so if you're not allowing for new housing, you're not allowing for new growth. So as we think about the implications on the tax base of no growth in housing, that becomes really important. What does that do to the municipal finances if there's no housing coming in? So it's kind of a balance of all of these. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for the current community and current housing? So the housing production plan, so that was a comp plan. The housing production plan made a couple of recommendations. One was to think about how do you create affordable ownership and affordable rental units. You want a diversity of housing. Anybody who's ever read anything about the stock market, they always talk about, diversify your investments. Well, that's true of a community when it comes to housing and economic development as well. Then how do you think, we're very fortunate in New England that we have a lot of older, beautiful homes, and some of them are quite large. So how do we think about, could you convert a traditional single-family home into 2 units, into 3 units? This is actually a topic we're talking about with a lot of communities. You get to retain that existing building, and you get some, financial benefit to doing that. That helps you rehabilitate that. A homeowner who may be thinking, I can't keep this up, I'm going to sell it, rather than having it be torn down. You turn it into 2 units instead of 1, and there's that financial incentive to keep it. And then thinking about other housing types, the housing production plan recommended congregate living, small multifamily unit, small cottage style units. We're going to be talking a lot about building types today, so get your thoughts on those. So this study is really about 2 things. One is aligning the current zoning with your housing needs and your preferences. That's the big thing. When we came out of the comprehensive plan, 3A wasn't actually on the radar yet. So that's what we wanted to look at. I mean, they were talking about it at the legislature, but really hadn't come to the point where we knew how it's going to impact communities. So the big thing was, how do you address Groveland's housing needs? So that's step 1. And then step 2, as part of that, how do you comply with Section 3A? How did the state law that requires multifamily housing? How is that part of your overall housing strategy? So when you think about zoning, you think about it at certain scales, right? Every property that's out there, if you're a property owner, your property is zoned for something that controls the use on it. It controls the dimensional standards. How do we use that? Then you start thinking about, well, what's the impact of zoning on a neighborhood? As I think about the different things that are in my neighborhood that are governed by housing, whether it's single family or 2 family, whether there's commercial mixed in or not. Maybe it's non-conforming. I've had any number of communities where they say, I love my neighborhood the way it is. And I say, that's great. It's a beautiful neighborhood, but your current zoning doesn't allow that. I was on a planning board for many years. Somebody came up to me at a grocery store and said, hey, I want to talk to you about this house that just went into my neighborhood. It's huge. It's not fitting in. And I said, I'm really sorry, but that's what the current zoning for that neighborhood allows. So that's where we talk about the right sizing. The other part that we have in a neighborhood is maybe people aren't investing because it's non-conforming. So non-conforming means it doesn't meet the zoning. And so I want to put a front porch on. Well, it's non-conforming. You have to go get a variance to do that. I want to put a back porch. It might not even be that what you're doing is non-conforming, but because the building or the lot itself is non-conforming, you, the property owner, have an extra step. So we're sort of right-sizing that. And then the town is the third part. How does zoning affect the town as a whole? We've already talked about the diversification of housing types. We've talked about how that can help the community. It can help the tax base. It can also help in economic development. If you have, people who are the housing types clustered in a particular area that can walk to businesses, then that can help those businesses. So we try and think about how the balance of these uses can help the town as a whole. So our existing condition analysis, we talked about this already, a little bit about the nonconformities. So a parcel or a lot where the dimensional measurements don't comply with the current zoning regulations in the area. So there is a map over there, and I'm about to show it on screen as well, but it's going to be easier when you get up to go and have a look at it. That looks at how we analyze nonconforming lots. So it could be the frontage, which is the line across the street. When you've got the front lot line of a parcel, right along the street is the lot frontage. The front yard setback is how far you have to go back from that frontage in order to build the building. The lot area is the total size of the lot. Building coverage is the amount of building footprint you can have on the lot. And lot coverage, which some communities use, is the footprint plus parking or other impervious surfaces. Some communities do building coverage and impervious coverage separately. Some communities do them together. So we analyze it like that. Sure.
I'm not quite sure what you're talking about right now. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah, go right ahead.
No, I'm good right here. Thank
No,
you.
but people can't. It's probably important.
It's actually just being taped.
Oh, good. Okay, so then I'll have to. So my question is,
Or I'll repeat it.
why are you analyzing when you say non-conforming lots, you mean were they built as non-conforming or did they become non-conforming?
They were probably built.
Oh, he's going to give me the extra special mic.
You get the extra special.
Oh,
I'm the other one.
lovely now, and it's green. Yes, so they weren't built in a non-conformance. You're saying they became non-conforming.
They may have been built before zoning.
Okay.
So they may have been, it's not that they were built to be non-conforming, it's just that zoning didn't exist. And when zoning came into place, it doesn't always match with what's on the ground.
Right, and so is that where, like, most people that don't know all the lingo would hear, well, that one's grandfathered. It's allowed to stay this way because it was there when the zoning came in.
Grandfathered is absolutely a term. It can be either it was before, it's an older term, but I know what you're talking about. What it means as a definition is that it was either built before zoning. So yes, it doesn't conform, but it's allowed to stay. You can have a non-conforming building that's grandfathered in. You could have a non-conforming lot. It's too small. You can also have a non-conforming use, and in all those cases, they're allowed to stay as they are. The problem comes when there's going to be a change. So let's just say you have a house on a non-conforming lot. Let's say you are supposed to be set back 10 feet from the road. That's your front setback, and you're only 8 feet from the road. So you're now non-conforming because you don't meet your front yard setback. Now let's say you'd like to put a porch on the back of your house. Nothing to do with the front yard setback. But because you're non-conforming, you have to go for a variance and say, I know I'm nonconforming. I'm not doing something we call increasing the nonconformity. You're not affecting that front yard setback. Now, some communities have rules that allow them to modify that and say, well, if you're not increasing that nonconformity, you're not doing anything to the front yard, you're okay. But you still have to go through a process. What we like to do when we're looking at a community's zoning is say, can we fix this? Can we change the rules such that all of those houses that are non-conforming become conforming? And that's where this analysis comes in.
Thank you.
Yes.
You answered it exactly.
Yes.
So much.
I figured I knew where you were going.
You did.
Yes, yeah.
I appreciate
But I wanted to break it down. So this analysis tells us the map that's here and the one over there, second from the left, so you can walk up and really look at it, tells us how many parcels are non-conforming now. And we have the breakdown that tells us why they're non-conforming. So that's why we did that is, and you can see in certain parts of town, there's a lot. Some of them will be the older parts of town, and in some parts of the town, there's not much nonconformity at all, and that's fine. That lets us know a lot. So that's Groveland as a whole, right? Let's talk about fixing the nonconformities. Let's talk about housing needs. Now we're going to jump to Section 3A. So Section 3A, you've probably all heard of it referred to as the MBTA Communities Act, but it's actually Section 3A of Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 40A, which are the zoning. It's the enabling legislation for zoning. So it's passed in 2021. It requires that each of 177 designated MBTA communities, which is also defined by the law. I get a lot of people going, why am I an MBTA community? I don't have a train or a subway. It's because under the law, you were defined as an MBTA community. In Groveland's case, you're an adjacent, because you're adjacent to Haverhill, small town. Because you're a small town. So you have to have zoning that allows for multifamily. So one district of reasonable size, can't be age restricted because it has to be suitable for families with children, must have a minimum gross density of 15 dwelling units per acre, and it has to be located, this part doesn't apply to you because you're a small, adjacent small town, but for those that have these things, you have to be located within that area. So I mentioned that you're adjacent small town. Haverhill's got the commuter rail, and you have a year-round population of less than 7,000. That's how you qualify as a small town. So you've got some different requirements from some of the other communities. So you still have to have the 15 dwelling units per acre because everybody has to have that. Your minimum unit capacity, and I'll define that in a minute, is 130 units. Your minimum contiguous district size, which is a mathematical calculation we have to pay attention to, is 50% of the total district size. And you don't have a minimum land area. So the small towns on up, so the rapid transit, the commuter rail, the adjacent towns, they all have minimum land area. It does make the calculations a little tricky. You don't have a minimum land area. You just have to meet the number of units in the unit capacity and the density requirement. I'm going to break down each of these terms. So the unit capacity, there's a couple of ways that you demonstrate compliance. When you apply to EOHLC, you say, we are compliant with 3A because we have zoning that is compliant, and we prove that the zoning is compliant because we have filled out what's called the compliance model, and the compliance model shows us that we meet that minimum unit capacity and the minimum density. The compliance model is based on maps, geographic information layers, and the one over on the far left is the information that we use as the base part of the model. You then show that there's an area, and you calculate the unit capacity and the density based on the area. We're going to be talking about areas today. We don't yet have an area to calculate on, but we have tested these 4 areas, and we know they are compliant based on the criteria that we used. So that other half of that test is an Excel spreadsheet. And that Excel spreadsheet pulls in the information from the mapping and the test information from the zoning, and it calculates these things. Now, the density is just simply dwelling units divided, the number of dwelling units divided by the number of acres. So in order to get to your 15 dwelling units per acre, it's going to be 15 equals 130 dwelling units divided by some number. It's 9-ish acres, just so you know, that's your minimum. Unit capacity. Now, interestingly, we put a survey out that was a true-false survey that some of you participated in last time, where we asked you a bunch of questions and said there are true and false. We put that online. Over 70% of Groveland participants in this believe that 3A establishes a housing production target that communities must meet. And that's the confusion around the unit capacity, is a lot of people, not just Groveland, a lot of people in the communities assume that if you have a unit capacity of 130 units, that the town has to build those numbers, that somebody's going to come along with a clipboard at some point and say, you didn't build your 130 units. That's not true for two reasons. One is the town is not required to build any housing at all. This is zoning, right? The town just has to create zoning that would allow for the production. And the second part is the unit capacity is a way of measuring. It's one of the ways of measuring whether or not the district is of reasonable size. Nobody is using that to say, you said you were going to do 130 units, where are they? Everybody recognizes that zoning is a long-term thing. Those units may never be built with zoning because it's up to the property owner to decide whether or not they want to take advantage of the zoning to create any housing at all. So the town is just responsible for creating the district. The unit capacity and the density just shows that the unit capacity and the acreage show that's a district of reasonable size. The density, that 15 dwelling units per acre, is required by law. There's a couple of other things that 3A is not, so it's not that mandate. Again, the town's not responsible for building it. It's not a housing production target. Some of the other questions we get, it's not restricted to affordable housing. In fact, most of the units will be market rate. The town has the option of requiring affordable housing, but it's a low limit that they can do. And as we're talking about today, it's not the only tool a community has for building housing. Changing the zoning in other parts of the town helps with that. So I'm almost done with 3A, and I'm going to turn you over to Supriya. I do want to give out the definition of multifamily housing. It's a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units, or 2 or more buildings on the same lot with more than one residential dwelling unit in each building, which is a lot of words to say that the minimum would be 2 duplexes on one lot, more than one building with more than one unit in each. The maximum, of course, can be whatever the town zones for. A lot of people have seen this diagram. It's done by a company called Opticos. You can see their logo down in the corner. It's talking about missing middle housing. We have detached single-family homes, which small communities are very familiar with. We have what they call mid-rise buildings over to the far right that you would see typically in a much more urban environment. But there's a sort of missing bit that's not typically getting built that might range from 2 units, 3 units, all the way up to something like 8 to 20 units. So we're not testing all of these housing types with you because many of them aren't appropriate to Groveland. So you'll see when Supriya takes over that we are going to test some of the housing types, multifamily housing types, on the lower end of the scale because we're curious if they are appropriate for Groveland, and that's what you're going to tell us tonight. So just to let you know, I've got 3 more maps. This is the map that's down at the far left. The green area is what's called excluded land. You can't build on that. This is how we get to the maps that you're going to see over there. You also have a lot of what's called sensitive land, which you can build on for the purposes of the compliance model, but we just want to note that it may have some environmental considerations. So we took some of that into account as we talked about the areas last time. We also looked at this, yes?
Could you just tell me why something's excludable?
Yeah, absolutely. It may be. So why is land excludable? It's not available for development, so sometimes it's water, right? GIS looks at everything, so water, surface water resources, Title V buffers, wetland buffers, conservation land, municipally owned land is not available for housing because it's owned by the municipality. Some state, you can see a lot of green where you know DCR is, so state and protected conservation land is also not available for development. So the state created these GIS layers for the excluded land and for the sensitive land. Sensitive land might be a floodplain, for example. It might be areas that have some sort of other sensitive conservation or environmental, but they're not absolutely 100% prohibited from being developed. One of the things that some communities may look at, communities that are perhaps along the coast might look at, are we in the FEMA boundary for some of this? That could be sensitive land. So they may have policies in place about allowing people to develop on that. So the sensitive land is for your information, but the green, and that's the hatch that you'll see on that map, but the green land is absolutely not available for development. So, and then that means that the white area, non-green, is available for the compliance model to look at. Still may not be where you want to look at, and that's why you'll see the 4 areas that we identified at the last meeting in a few minutes. Yeah.
I hate to wait because then I'll forget my question.
Of course, understood.
So the thing that concerns me the most, because I've been listening to it, I've been trying to read some of the things, and it's, if you're not a town planner, it's a foreign language. Like for me, it's a foreign language. The 130.
Yes.
Yes. So I guess the basic question I have is when and if we do some kind of a change in our zoning, do we have to do it in such a way that there would be available land for 130 units? That's what I want to know. I'm not worried about us having to build these things. I'm concerned about whether or not the zoning would then allow an onslaught of builders to come in and build a lot of small units, possibly more than our infrastructure can support.
So you have to zone for a unit capacity of 130 units, minimum unit capacity. So the question was, do we have to? You have to zone for that minimum unit capacity. That zoned area can be on an area that already has housing on it, and you'll see in the 4 areas that we came up with at the last meeting that there is housing already on some of the lots within each area. The property owner always has the option as to whether or not they want to take advantage of the zoning. I think this is really important because I have had questions in other communities where somebody says, you've rezoned my land, do I have to develop it now? No, zoning is an option always. So what that means is you say your house was in one of the zones. The zoning has changed, but it doesn't mean that you have to change your property at all. Zoning is always an option.
Yes, but the 130, that number, is that specific to Groveland?
Yes, it is. It's based on your the number of housing units you had in the 2020 census. There's a mathematical formula that differs slightly, but
So
that's the original base.
the 130 does not include the existing multifamily housing.
Very good. Great question. So zoning does not care what's there now, right? As far as the language of zoning is concerned, all it wants to know is what could be. It's about possibility. So if you are a community, I've had a couple of communities recently where their zoning for 3A includes some existing multifamily. So let's just say that they had a unit capacity requirement of 1,000 units, right? For this particular community. They rezoned an area that already had some multifamily. Say it already has 500 on it. The compliance model shows that there's a capacity for 1,000. They could, there's some areas around that where they could add some units, but their net increase would only be, if there's a capacity of 1,000, they've already got 500, their net increase would only be 500 units because they already have 500 units. Zoning doesn't care about what's on the ground. The model calculates the capacity of the zoning. It doesn't then subtract the amount that's already there. So you just have to zone for 130 units over the right amount of land. If there's already 50 units in that area, say, then your net is going to be a potential of 80 new units.
Okay, so Groveland's
Yeah.
target is 130.
Its minimum requirement is 130
And
units.
as we look at the areas that you're going to bring to our attention,
Yep.
we can subtract from that number
You,
any of the multifamily housing that complies, or is it just?
no,
Okay, I
that's
was
not how
afraid.
that works. It's just what's on the ground now would be your net, but it doesn't have any impact on the compliance model. You don't subtract that out of the compliance model.
But that, you just said you would subtract the 500 from the
No.
1,000. I'm so.
If you were concerned about the net change in units, you could subtract it out. But that's not how the compliance model does it. The compliance model assumes there's nothing on the ground.
Okay.
Yes.
I gotcha.
Yes.
That part.
Yes.
This, you can see why people feel
Absolutely.
very ambivalent about this.
And you can see why I'm taking a lot of time around this, because I want to make sure that you understand every point. So
Yeah,
all of
thank
you
you so much.
collectively. Yeah.
I have some comments.
Sure. And then I've got a few more maps. Yep.
Joe Demore, 9 Cherry Tree Lane. Emily, we worked together on the master plan.
That's right. I recognized your face.
Thank you, and we did some good work. So the master plan, for many decades, this town, like many towns and cities in Massachusetts, had to comply with a 10% rule.
Right.
You'd have 10% of affordable housing. That was in the master plan. 2 new laws now have come that are really potentially could change the landscape of Groveland, converting it from what most of us want and what we came here for, other than those people that grew up here and been here for decades, and that is that this is a bedroom community. We can't pretend that there is another law, the accessory dwelling units.
Can you hold off comments on
I
the
will.
accessory
But
dwelling
my
units?
question
till
is,
the
if
end?
I live
Yes.
at 9 Cherry Tree Lane,
Yes.
and at 9 Cherry Tree Lane, going back to what Kathy said, happens to be a district where zoning for one of the 130 cannot be done. Let's just assume that.
Okay.
But yet, in my backyard, I'll put a 900 square foot unit for an ADU. We won't get credit for that ADU towards the 130, correct?
Correct, because it's not multifamily. So what you
Correct.
have, what you would then have is, just so you all know, is with the ADU, you would have a single-family home, and then you would have an accessory dwelling unit. So it doesn't meet the 3 units per lot, or the 2 buildings with more than 1 unit in each building. So yes, you don't get credit
So the
for that.
selling point at town meeting potentially is that we have to tell people, we have to create the zoning, but don't worry, that doesn't mean we have to actually build. But the zoning does have to be created, and under penalty from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that potentially state aid could be withheld if we don't put the zoning in place. Is that true or not?
That is true.
That is
So people have maybe been following, there was a case in front of the Supreme Judicial Court. If you don't mind, before we go into all of this, I'd like to finish what we're doing today, and then we'll do questions at the
Okay, I
end.
appreciate
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Thank you, and hold on to those questions. Yes.
I do have one quick question.
Yes.
Ron Cannizzaro, 27 Groveland Commons. You had indicated earlier in your dissertation that the math that you used to calculate the 130 units was based upon the 2020 census and the amount of homes that are in the town at the time.
The math the state uses, not that I use.
Okay,
That's
well,
from the state.
The
Yeah,
point
just
I
checking.
get at is that as the community grows and more homes are built, does that change the math on the 130 units?
Great question. Absolutely, yeah.
Does it move, or is it static, it stays at that point?
It stays at that point. You are required only to meet that 130 unit. It is not changing after that. And there is, I can point you all to it later after we do the exercises. I can bring up the website for the state that has all of the details about this. I'm obviously extrapolating to the lower amount. All right, so next map. This is the one that's at the very end. And this is what we talked about with the select board at the very beginning of this process last fall. We have some criteria that we use to think about where a good place to locate housing might be. Proximity to schools, proximity to the bus line in your case, proximity to being able to walk to parks. There's a whole long list that we have. And we ranked it so that if you had one of those criteria, you're the lightest color. If you had 5 of those criteria, you're the darker color. In some communities, we've had further discussions about how to rank the criteria, and we can always do that. But this is just meant to give you a general idea of where in town is proximate to other assets that would contribute to a good place to have housing and be able to walk to amenities. And then finally, the last map for this is what type, and this is second from the right, so you can go up and look at it, what types of housing already exist in Groveland. So, bless you. So the single-family residential is the purple area, no surprise, there's a lot of that. You do also have 2-family and 3-family units, and we actually looked at that at the last meeting at the sort of density calculations. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that presentation, I suggest you might want to go back. You do have 4 to 8 and 9+ units as well, and you have mixed-use units, and some condominiums. So this just gives you an idea of the profile that you already have in this area. So with that, I'm going to see if there are any other questions about the work done to date. Then we're going to turn it over to Supriya to tell you what you're doing with all of these maps and things. And then we'll come back for general questions and comments and statements. So haven't forgotten about you. Yes. Of course.
In one of the first slides, you showed that people who live in Groveland are not able to age out in Groveland. And I have two questions kind of on that. Well, maybe 3, actually. I'm not aware of any survey that has determined that one way or the other, because one of the last pushes I saw through our Council on Aging was the aging in place. Mm-hmm. And of course, the commercials on TV are now all gearing to that as well. But then in the context of your presentation, you said in our compliance, we can't age restrict the multi-housing. So you can't guarantee that you're going to be providing units for people who are trying to move to a smaller home anyway.
That is correct, but I also did say that, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I understand the need to comply with the law.
Right.
I just don't want to confuse it with other issues that are before the town. Because I know some people who are aging in town have said, the biggest concern they have is the taxes.
Right.
They want some relief from the taxes. They don't want to necessarily leave their home.
Right.
So I guess I just don't want this. I'm wondering when we go public with this, if we can just whittle it down to the really straightforward stuff that we've got to know that we have to do. That's all.
Yep, great points. So a couple of things on that. One is the findings I presented to you at the beginning were from the comprehensive plan. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to show you the overall context of housing in Groveland. I did also mention that 3A is not the only housing tool. So that's important to know, is that it is just part of this overall strategy in thinking about this. And then finally, you don't have to have age-restricted housing in order to have housing that's suitable for seniors. You can have age-friendly housing by design. There's a practice in both architectural and interior design called universal design, and it's designing housing for people who have maybe aging, people who have problems with mobility, perhaps they're physically disabled, perhaps they're just, stiff and sore, like some of us after a long day. But the idea is that you're designing housing that can be accessed by anybody, no matter their age or their physical mobility. So that's not age restricted, it is designed well. And that's the sort of thing where if you're looking at the total solutions for a community, you want to make it possible to have all of these types of housing. And I guess that's back to the diversification, right? We're looking today at 3A, but we are also, as Supriya will tell you, looking at the entire town and thinking what's appropriate elsewhere in town that doesn't meet 3A, but does meet some of the housing needs. So with that, if there are no other questions, I will turn it, has it disappeared? Oh, well, I will give it back to you to, you get it?
Maybe.
There, perfect, beautiful. All right, so you're going to tell us what we're going to do.
Yes, we are. Okay. So after all of the analysis that Emily talked about and is presented here, we, with the town, shortlisted 4 sites. Washington and Maine with 20 acres, and I'm calling out the acres because it's a crucial piece of information that we'll discuss later. School in Pleasant with 8 acres, Union to Gardner, the orange one with 12 acres, and Perry Park with 6 acres. So currently, Groveland does not allow multifamily by right. So none of these options are actually compliant right now, but by allowing multifamily by right in these districts and working with lot sizes, we can actually make these options compliant. So the current lot sizes for these sites is 30,000 and 20,000 by R2 and R3 respectively. And this is where the acres come in play. So we need a minimum of 130 units, and it needs to be minimum of 15 dwelling units per acre. The only variable in all of these 4 sites is the acreage. So if a site has a lot more acreage than the ideal 9 acres that this formula requires, we will meet the 15 acres density, but we will get way more than 130 units in that area. Now, if the acreage is smaller than the 9 acres, we will need a way higher density than 15 to get the 130 units. And that is kind of important because I'll come to that. And again, as Emily said, unit capacity does not equal new units. So the first option is the Main Street. It borders Haverhill. So to make this work, again, pay attention to the acres. So it's 20 acres. So the lot sizes can stay around 20,000. And because we did the non-conforming analysis, we know what exists on ground in terms of lot sizes and how many don't conform. So 20,000 actually works with what exists on site. So that is option number 1. And again, some of the parcels already have 2-family housing in this area. Option 2 is School in Pleasant. So again, because this is 8 acres, the lot sizes drop quite a lot lower, so 5,000. Again, the minimum lot acre, there are a few lots on this site that have 5,000-ish sizes and which are non-conforming according to the current zoning. Option 3 would be Union and Gardner. Again, a slight drop because we have more acres than the 9 acres that we need. Again, this lot size actually already exists, and this area also has 2-family. Option 4 has 2-family and 3-family already on ground. Again, with a lower acreage, we need to drop the lot sizes to get more density. And that went away. I'll just stand here. I won't take too long, I promise. So that brings us to our 2 questions or the 2 exercises for tonight. So we are going to ask you, or we need answers from you. Okay.
Yeah, I'll stay here. I don't know what's going on.
Recording in progress.
Okay. So we need answers for 2 questions from everyone tonight. All of you have 7 cards in hand. Those cards provide a diverse options of housing types that are suitable for Groveland. On table number 1, there are 4 boxes. Each box has 1 site on it. So the question is, what are the suitable housing types for each of the site? You can pick 3 housing types for 1 site. You can pick.
Sorry, no, sorry about that.
Okay.
Just making sure that it's working.
You can pick all 7 for 1 site and be like, we don't want the rest of the 3 have any options. So you can play with how you want to vote for the sites. But this is one of the first questions we want to ask. In the second exercise, we zoom out. And this is where we step away from the. Okay, I'm just going to wait. Okay. So in the second exercise, in the second question we are asking, we are zooming away for the entire town of Groveland. And this is stepping away from the 3A compliance and all of that. This is just a general question of what other location are these housing types suitable? Where do you think that we need more housing or different types of housing should be allowed? So we have on the table number 2 right there, we have stickers for all of the same housing types that you have the cards for. And if there are any areas that you want us to consider, we have sticky notes and markers. But the table number 1 is 3A focus, table number 2 is Groveland focus. And once you take some time to review that, and we are here to discuss all of these, if you have any questions while doing these exercises, when you're reviewing that, we also have all the analysis right here. If you want to look at any parcels closely, we can take some time to do these exercises and then come back, and if there are any questions and answers, we can do that. Yes.
I mean, I appreciate that you're here and you're trying to engage us and get us to do something, but like there's 12 to 15 people in this room and it's a town of 7,000.
Yes.
And to just put a card in a box, I'm sorry. I'm not all in on that idea. I visually would need to see what's on that housing-wise, what's already there, and potentially what would happen to it if it were zoned for that housing, like a dynamic model. And I feel like that would probably engage more people in our town with this process, because I might not be the only one that just looks at these maps. I know they're very intricate, and I know you've put a lot of work into it, but to me, they're just kind of blotches. And so I just don't feel comfortable putting cards in a box and saying, yeah, you could put these houses there, because I'm not so sure that's the people that live there would say that would be what they want. And shouldn't everybody get to understand this as well? I mean, I'm understanding it more and more as you speak, and so I do appreciate everything you're doing tonight. But I'm just wondering how many people in our town don't really understand it. And I don't want to interfere with the process by putting cards in a box on a street that says, yeah, put them here. So, with all due respect,
So
I don't feel comfortable doing that at this point.
I'm going to take the first part of the question. So these meetings are heavily publicized. They are on all town forums. They have been brought up in all the town meetings. So there is a continuous public outreach that happens so that everyone can hear about these meetings and can come and make their voice known. Today, you're here. So your voice matters because you're here. So you vote because what you feel is appropriate in that area. This process will also be taken online in next week so that people who cannot be here or be present and make their voice known can do it online. We do everything, the town as well, to make these processes known and educate as much as possible. But because you're in the room today, your vote matters because you're speaking for yourself.
I don't want to belabor it, but the second part, do you have a dynamic model whereby we would see what's in that area already and what a change in zoning could potentially do? And as you pick a card, you could see what could possibly happen there, because I think that's like the average person would want to know. Otherwise, when you don't understand something, especially at our annual town meeting, you vote no.
Yeah.
That's the general path in this town. If you don't understand, if it doesn't, you're not quite sure what's going on, you're going to vote no.
Yeah.
So I feel like we need to see something that the everyday person can look at who drives past these parts of town and say, oh, I see. Okay? Because I get that you're not mandating us to build.
Yes.
But the change in zoning will allow either the property owner to do something or them to sell part of the property or all of it, and somebody else to do something. So kind of want to know what we're talking about. And I would need something that really shows me a picture of each section of town with what it has, and then push a button and put this there or that there. I don't know. Something. Is that possible? When you say you're going online, could you provide that?
So right now, we are trying to understand what you would like to see. If we don't know what you would like to see there, we can't actually because nothing is zoned right now. We are trying to understand what to zone for. So when we know what type of housing types you're comfortable with, if you flip the card, there's a picture of how it looks like. But when we know what you're comfortable with, the housing types, then we can actually work on maybe building a 3D or showing it more in a 3D format. But right now, we are coming in, these are all the housing types that are possible in all of these areas. You get to pick and tell us that this is what we are comfortable with, and then we can go back and build that model for you to show you what it would look like if it gets changed to that.
If you think of this,
Mhm.
everything you said is exactly
Yeah.
right. If you think of this as an iterative process, our first community meeting, we introduced what this was about. We talked about areas. We heard back from the people who were at the meeting. These are the areas that we came up with. This second meeting, we're now talking about building types and densities. Given the areas, here are some building types that could work. What do you think of that? And so then with that information, we can start putting things together, so it's something where we can say to the community, exactly what you've asked for, this is what's there now, based on what we've heard, this is what it could look like, what do you think? And so we're trying to balance the in-person with the online. There's a website that's been active for quite some time that has a lot of this information on there. It allows people to look at what's on the ground. What we're hoping to do is, after we get some feedback from you today, is to put this same thing online so people can do the same exercise that weren't in the room, and then we can put all of that together. But in every community we work with, there are people who can't be here in person and people who can. So we try and break it up to make sure as many people can speak as possible. But it is critically important now that you're here, all of you are here, that we hear from you today, so we know how to take the next step and bring back more choices to the community. Yes.
I appreciate what you're doing. The communities in Massachusetts that have an MBTA station need to be compliant to the 3A on December 31st of 2024. Groveland is an adjacent community. We must be compliant by December 31st of 2025. What I'm alarmed about is that in 90 days, we're going to have a town meeting, and I don't know what this warrant would look like. Are we deciding whether to be compliant or not, or are we deciding where we could be compliant? Because that's going to be really difficult for people.
Yes.
So. So at the current plan is that after we hear from you, after we hear what's online with the public, we will have draft zoning text available and a draft zoning map that says this is the area, these are the uses being housing, the dimensional standards, the development standards, and the design guidelines. Those may sit outside zoning, but it'll be a package together. That's what will go to town meeting. So when town meeting votes, assuming we're staying with the spring town meeting, which is what our schedule says, when town meeting votes, they will be voting on a zoning article as in any other zoning article that they might have voted on.
And you're going to put the warrant together?
We're going to put the zoning together that would go on the spring town.
So in other words, you're making recommendations.
Right, but we would have a point, for those, I don't know how many of you have seen zoning go through a town process, but typically it goes to the planning board for a public hearing, so there's public comment at that point, and then, the planning board would typically make a motion on the floor of town meeting if there were any changes from the public hearing. So this would follow the normal zoning process.
Okay,
for
so
town meeting.
input from us, whether you receive it or not, regardless, a warrant article is going to be created by you making recommendations and then going to the authorities like the planning.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, this is a standard zoning process.
And they will be the authors of the warrant article.
They're the ones who sponsor it as
They're
forward.
going to have to be
absolutely.
for it, and they're going to have to rationalize it and sell it. That's the goal.
We are consultants,
I
so we
understand.
provide the information to
Sure.
you, but we don't,
We're thankful to have you.
Yes.
We appreciate that. But like I said, in 90 days, what do? In 90 days, what we need to do is we we have to raise our hand, yes or no, we're going to be compliant. And if we're not compliant, we need to have a discussion as to what the consequences will be.
That is true, and that is on the political side, right? We can help you by giving you the information, by helping you form criteria for what you want to do, by making choices, giving us, and then by drafting the article. But obviously, the vote, the discussion, all of that, that's a community discussion.
And on the same
Yeah.
night, are you going to help us with the ADUs? Because on that same long night, we also have to deal with accessory dwelling units.
We have not yet talked about the ADUs with Rebecca and Annie, so.
Because the dynamics of that, in my mind, is like a request from the school system for an override times 10.
So again, can we talk about the AD, because the ADUs are not part of what we're talking about tonight. Happy to take them at the end, but we've been talking to you all for an hour, and we would like you to at least engage with the materials. So happy to come back for Q&A afterwards. Yes, sir. Just one moment, ma'am. We've got a gentleman back here.
The locations that you picked out,
So we did not pick them out, but go ahead.
those little areas that
Right.
you see there, those are theoretical as to the type of house, correct?
Absolutely, that's what we're asking you today.
Like the bottom section there, you couldn't put virtually any of these houses in that section because there's no sewer there.
So,
We'll do any of that.
love that question. Zoning does not talk about sewer, right? If you are zoned, you're allowed to put something there. If you can't meet Board of Health, if there's no sewer, and you can't meet Board of Health requirements for a septic system, and you can't meet Concom requirements for, wetlands protection, and you can't meet the building code for something, you can't build there. Zoning only addresses one part of development. It doesn't address everything. So even though it's multifamily as of right, if other conditions apply in the town for development, whoever's proposing this has to follow those other conditions. They can't violate building code. They can't violate Board of Health code. They can't violate Concom. So it's really important when you look at these areas, that knowledge that you just brought up and said, there's wetlands here, there's going to be a wetlands buffer, maybe this parcel can't be built on. That's true. Zoning doesn't care about that, but other regulations do, and that's really important to know. So thank you for bringing that up.
So
So.
if you picked another parcel that had no sewer anywhere in the area, and then streams with setback issues,
So.
you're gonna zone it to this, and there's your area.
That's where you get into the excluded land. And the other important thing to remember is that after the town meeting vote, let's be positive tonight. Let's assume that town meeting has voted in favor of whatever the zoning is. After that, what happens is the zoning, the map, and the compliance model go to EOHLC, which is the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, and they have to sign off on that. And they will look for that. So one of the things that they do look for is, did you create zoning in such a way that something could not actually be built? They will reject that, and you will not be compliant. So, please, with your permission, I would really like you to engage with the materials. If you don't like it, you don't have to put anything in there, but we just want you to have a chance to actually look, not on screen, but actually look at the map and see what they say. Again, the areas came from the last workshop we did. We'll take maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll come back for final Q&A, okay? Thank you. All right, everybody, let's come on back, do final Q&A. Thank you for participating. We appreciate it. All right, so Supriya, while we talk, Supriya is counting up the results to see what we have. We've got the report out. So while we're talking, I just want to put up the website so that you all can go and look. We just need to translate what we did today into an online format, and we'll let Rebecca and Annie know when that's ready sometime next week, and then we can push that out so people who weren't here today can participate, which will be excellent. So that's up for you to all to look at. Supriya and Jimmy are counting up the results. So any more questions? You were first, sir. Come on up. Or grab the mic wherever the mic went.
It's the one on the right.
There you go.
Thank you, Emily. So for clarification purposes, there's no crediting system. We don't get credits by building lots of ADUs towards
No,
this.
they're unrelated.
We don't get credits for existing affordable units towards this.
Right.
This is just 130, have it zoned, it might never be built, but that in itself is a tough sell. It might be built, but
Right.
we have to put it on the books.
Exactly.
And the consequences are specifically, do you know what they are?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. A lot of people have asked about this. So there are 4 grants that are listed in the law itself that if a community doesn't comply, they no longer have access to those grants. One of them is MassWorks, which is a big infrastructure grant. One of them is the relatively new Housing Works program. And then there's 2 others in there that I'm sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head. And then in the regulations, there's a list of another, I think it's 13 grants that the communities aren't eligible for. One of those, dear to my heart, is the Community One Stop program, because that's the one that has a whole lot of grants under it and is in fact paying for this effort on behalf of the towns. So that's an important, from the perspective of planners, that's an important one for towns to be able to have access to.
And we have been recipients, thanks to the
Yes.
wonderful people that are leaders in this town. We've been recipients of grants. So other than grants, the core state aid component is not something that they are threatening us with.
So my understanding is it's
Yes.
it's the grants that are listed in the law, because that was done by the legislature. The grants that are listed in the regulations are what's known as discretionary grants. So if you've ever filled out a grant application, they'll sometimes ask you for criteria. One of the criteria in many grants, almost all grants, I think, are you compliant with state or federal law? So it may not be specific, but I have noticed for a few grant applications that I helped out with last year, or received actually when I received the project, I looked at the community's grant application, and there was a specific question that asked if you were compliant with Section 3A. So,
Last one,
Yes.
if you know,
yeah,
you're very knowledgeable.
I do my best.
My understanding is we were compliant to accessory dwelling units. Now we're not because of the update.
That's a really good question. So I'll speak first, and then I'm going to let Annie say that. You already had accessory dwelling units on your books. So Annie, why don't you take over?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Schindler. I'm the executive coordinator, if you don't know me. We currently do allow for accessory dwelling units in our residential zones, but the stipulation is that they must be attached to the primary dwelling. In our industrial zone, we allow for something called a caretaker unit. So the thought is that a business owner could have one of their employees or something of that nature live above their business to, ensure on the weekends and in the evenings that everything's okay and things like that. So we have draft bylaws for the new ADU bylaw that we have been working on with our building commissioner, Sam Joslin. And he's worked directly with the state on helping draft the regulations that came out, I believe, yesterday. So we are actively working on it. We do allow for ADUs currently, just only attached, but come Monday, the state law will trump that.
Thank you. And so Annie and Rebecca, therefore, that will be a warrant article potentially? It will. It definitely will be. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, no problem.
All right.
No further questions or comments.
Thank you.
I've gotten into enough trouble tonight.
No trouble at all. Literally, that's why we're here, is to try and answer as many questions as we can. So, Mike, I see you reaching for the
Why
mic.
do we have to vote on ADUs this year? Are we required to vote on it this year?
So the state legislature passed the new law on ADUs last summer. It goes into effect the 1st, right?
No, it was the second, which is a Sunday.
Right. So Monday, yeah, thank you. I was trying to remember it was the 1st or the 2nd. It actually goes into effect the 2nd, which means there are there are, now I have not read the final regulations. We all went over the draft together, but the final regulations just came out, as Annie said yesterday. I downloaded them today, didn't read them before this meeting. But my memory from the draft regulations is there are some things that are basic within the legislation and some things that a town can control. So if the town wants to exercise its options for some changes, then it needs to pass zoning that allows for that. And I gather that's what you all are looking at the moment. Yeah, we have not been involved in your ADU process.
So, I mean, it seems like a fool's errand, to tell you the truth, to try to do both of these at the same meeting. Why are we doing that?
I do not have the answer to that question.
I can tell you that regardless, it doesn't matter. For the ADUs, the law and the legislation, like Annie said, it takes precedent. So whatever you want to do that meets the state guidelines, you can do. The building commissioner cannot deny you a building permit to move forward with the state regulations as they will be issued and effective as of the February 3rd date. With the zoning that we have in place, it does not match what the state is requiring. So it's very confusing and it does not meet the regulations from the state. So we're looking to clean that up to make it so that it does coincide with the state regulations, and then also provide for the additional incentive through what we currently have in our bylaw for a special permit for accessory dwelling units that can no longer be called accessory dwelling units because the state definition takes precedent. So it doesn't matter if we pass ADUs at the town meeting or not. You're still going to be able to move forward with what is being put forward by the state. MBTA and 3A zoning is different.
Yes.
We must comply, we must pass zoning, or we do not get to take advantage of those other incentives. And there's also other potential ramifications that are unknown to us at this point in time. But with the ADUs, it's just to simplify the process and be clear and transparent. It does not matter what we do, we will need to allow them by right as it's dictated under the state law.
So with the ADU, you're really aligning the zoning to the state law.
Yes, I
MBTA,
understand
it's
that,
different,
but
yeah.
You answered my question. Why are we doing this in the same meeting? The argument against 3A is this. We don't want to see change in Groveland. We like the way Groveland is. We don't want such radical change as this is going to bring upon us. Add ADU on top of it, and then you give an even better case for that argument. And hey, we don't lose anything if we don't change the ADU thing this year. We could wait until 2026, but we are going to lose if we don't vote for 3A. So I really think we shouldn't be talking about ADUs at this year's meeting. But
I see a hand in the back. And I'm not ignoring your question. I just, as your consultant, I don't have the answer to that. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Mike, it's DJ. The ADU aspect is we are trying to get it to the way that we want it with the abilities that we have. If we don't pass, ADUs is for state level, it's passed. It's done deal. Nothing we have to do about it. But if we don't go to town meeting and vote on the amendments that we want to add to it to for Groveland's purposes, then we are at the mercy of the state level and not our town level. So that's why we want to put it on this warrant, because we want to put it to the Groveland standard, not just the state standard. So it's beneficial to us for Groveland to have our different amendments there on the ADU, because we don't want to be left at the state level. We want to have our own, we all want to have our own say with special permits, variances, things like that. So that's why the ADU is on there. 3A, completely separate. That's the loss of the funding. And for those of you who don't know, Milton has made there was an announcement on the Milton stuff. They won, but they didn't win, because they only won because of a technicality. Attorney General, I think is who it is that does it. They stated that only because Milton, the state, didn't submit it the proper way, that once they go resubmit the proper way, they have the ability to take additional funding as well. So that's why we need to look at this, because it's a done deal. They've said that it's written, it's going to happen. They have the right to do this, so we have to take a look at it. Hope that helps.
And just to add on to that, the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court, to your point exactly, they reaffirmed the legislation. They reaffirmed the Attorney General's ability to sue. They said that the guidelines that establish how all this works were improperly distributed. They needed to be regulations. They needed to follow the rules for regulations. So the state has reissued primarily the same document as emergency regulations. They are going through the appropriate process, and I believe the public comment period on those regulations starts tomorrow. And then, thank you, Annie, thank you for the nod, and runs for a couple of weeks into February. So that is now 21st. Okay, I couldn't remember if it was the 20th or the 21st. So they are going through that. But the emergency regulations, I actually had a client redline it and send it back to me. They are substantially the same. The one thing that definitely changed is some of the dates. So if you were a commuter rail community and thus had to be compliant as of December 31st, 24, you aren't, you have until July 25th, I believe, somewhere in July of this year to comply, because they're reissuing the guidelines. Unfortunately, for us tonight, the adjacent small town, your deadline is still the end of this year. Yeah, that did not change.
So I just had one question
Yeah.
relating the 3A.
Yeah.
Whatever zone, if we voted in and we pick whatever zone there is, and there's say 50, 70% of the zoning already meets the criteria, they change it to a 2-family, 3-family, whatever it is, and someone else after buys the property and says, I don't want this to be a 3-family, I want to make it into, or say it's more so a 2-family, and they want to make it back to a single family.
Right.
Is that allowed with
Yeah.
the, okay.
It
So
depends
you
on
can't
how you do
restrict
your
that.
zoning. So this is
Okay.
a really interesting question. We've got a group we could get a straw poll on. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. Primarily, there's two. One is to do change the base zoning. So everybody with property, their property is zoned for something, that's your base zone. And it allows you to have a single-family house, or a 2-family or 3-family or whatever. So we could change that. But that, depending on how you do it, then that whole little area is a brand-new zone. The other way to do it, and a lot of communities have done it this way, is they do what's called an overlay district. And an overlay district sits on top of that base zone. And what it does is say, okay, my property right now is zoned for single family. Great. I'm a single family. I'm fine. Now I've got this overlay district, and that overlay district allows me to do something else. I, as a property owner, can choose to keep my single family, or I can use the overlay. What I can't do is use both. So I can't say, I want to use the base district for the type of use, but I like the setback and the overlay. I want to use that. You cannot do that. You can't mix them. So that is a consideration. We could just do an overlay, for example, that says this area is going to allow for multifamily at these densities. It's going to have these design guidelines. Done and dusted. The property owner has absolutely the right to stay where they are. And if somebody creates a three-unit building, say they do a conversion of a building, a historic home to a 3-unit, if we allow that under the zoning, somebody comes back and says, no, I want that house to be a single family. They just have to follow the rules for the single family, and they can turn it back into a single family. It's absolutely allowed if we set it up that way.
Can you apply for an extension with a December deadline?
They've not allowed for it's a good question. They have not allowed for any extensions. So I don't expect to see that. I haven't seen it for anything else. Any other questions for tonight? This is not the last time that you get to, chat with us. Yeah, please save some questions. Always happy to answer more. Remember that there's the website here. We do have a form on there for more questions. So If you wake up in the middle of the night and think, yes, I have a burning 3A question, or a housing question in general, because this is still not just about 3A, please submit it to us. We are collecting them. We are looking for those questions. We can talk with Rebecca about, do we wait for the next meeting, or, do we do an FAQ and put that on the website? So we'll do our best to do that. And as I said, we'll have some form of this exercise online next week. Then you can tell all of your friends that they have to participate as well. So, and thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. So I know it's a cold night and this is a tough subject, so thank you.